think that's the most disappointing thing about the last two budgets, is they haven't been about tax reform. We have a ridiculously complicated tax system, and it would be really nice to have a chancellor who actually wanted to reform some taxes.
You know, the loss around pensions, or whether it's a change of rates around dividend if they're a smaller company. I really feel that middle's getting squeezed really quite hard. I think the UK public is saving 11 or 12% each month. And they're doing that because they're cautious. They're nervous perhaps about employment or about the state of the economy. And we need a confident country to get growth back in.
There are some people that are actually genuinely pretty happy in the technology world.
More money for tech bros is something we can all get behind, isn't it?
Well, tech bros and girls, Dom.
Sorry.
I hope you're not mansplaining to me. Finally, we know what was in the red box. One of the most anticipated and leaked budgets in living memory, I think.
Well, definitely the case. And I can give you the abridged version, the TLDR version. Lots of tax increases, some big, some small, 26 billion in all. Government debt staying high, no improvement in growth.
And of course, we didn't even have to wait for Rachel Reeves to stand up in the Commons to find out the details, because the Office of Budget Responsibility accidentally published its forecast a whole 40 minutes before Reeves arrived at the dispatch box.
Growth begins with the spark of an entrepreneur. Half of new jobs in Britain are created by scale-up businesses. And we want those jobs created here, not somewhere else. Our job is to make Britain the best place in the world to start up, to scale up and to stay.
But will her measures do what she hopes? Today we're going to look at the measures she announced, how the markets reacted, and whether all of that adds up to creating that elusive thing that business and the country are searching for, some growth.
I'm Hannah Prevett, Associate Business Editor of The Sunday Times.
And I'm Dominic O'Connell, Times columnist and the Times Radio's business correspondent.
And from The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Business,
where we bring you the behind-the-scenes conversations that we have normally with business leaders and actually let you listen in.
We pick apart one big business story each week with guests from the front line.
Well, Hannah, today there's really only one business worth talking about, and that is the budget, which everyone is calling a smorgasbord. You have to go smorgasbord, not smorgasbord. And to mix my culinary metaphors ridiculously, it really was the icing on what's been a long-baked cake, the idea of the UK economy becoming a high-debt, high-tax and low-growth economy.
And to pick it apart and consider what it means for business, we're joined by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Helen Miller. And in the studio with us here are Richard Fletcher, the Times' business editor, and Steve Rigby, Chief Executive of Rigby Group, one of the UK's largest family businesses, and in the top 500 largest family businesses in the whole world. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Richard, I have to say you're looking remarkably fresh for someone who's just been produced a budget supplement, had to do the budget itself on the day in terms of news terms. You've been doing this kind of thing for a while, though. How has the reporting of budgets and indeed the presentation of budgets by governments changed? It is so different to how it used to be, isn't it?
Yeah, as you correctly identify, I have been doing this for a little while. In fact, I'm slightly ashamed to admit this. When I first started covering budgets, it was pre-internet, and you had to wait. We had motorcycle couriers waiting at the Treasury, and they would pick up the Red Book. And in those days, it was 3 o'clock. There was none of this namby-pamby midday budgets. And at 3 o'clock, they'd be given, you'd get the Red Book and the courier would come in and they'd be sort of distributed to desks and everyone would pore over this paper copy. Obviously now, as the OBR discovered, you can just download them. So yeah, no, it was, and the other big change is the amount of pre-briefing and leaks. It's not true that there was never any pre-briefing, but typically you would get probably one or two stories in the Sunday papers the week before the budget, but that was it. It really was, there wasn't this, you get official press releases now with parts of the budget, so that has completely changed, and I think maybe that's been damaging to the process. If we are just going to release big chunks of the budget, why have the sort of pomp and ceremony of this big day, which no one else in Europe has? As for this budget, as you say, slightly different. I actually thought the dying days of the last Conservative administration kind of tested what these fiscal events were like. But, the leaking of the OBR document was really quite extraordinary. We were all chasing and obviously we managed to find it pretty quickly, like other people. But it was a real scramble, and quite exciting actually in some ways for a journalist. I do think on a serious note, I think the fact the OBR then took it down was actually a really big mistake, because I think in terms of, obviously it was market moving, the revelation that it was there was 21.7 billion buffer was far higher than expected. And that obviously had an effect in the money markets, and having leaked and having, the headlines having been posted on Reuters, they then managed to take the document down. So there were some people in the market who had it and could see that it was genuine, and there were some people in the market who didn't. And I think I do think sometimes government is very bad at handling what is market sensitive information. I remember a few years the Competition Markets Authority briefing out a finding of an inquiry the night before when it was clearly market moving, and you could see that the next day with share price moves. So yeah, it was a pretty extraordinary budget. We knew quite a lot of it before, and we knew even more of it 45 minutes before. So yeah.
Steve Rigby, welcome to The Business. Rigby Group spans something like £4 billion worth of privately owned business ventures, famously started with just £2,000 in 1975.
Indeed, 50 years old this year.
Well, congratulations. Happy birthday to you. The Family Business Association, which of course you're the chairman of, is that
Indeed,
right?
Yes.
Had its annual reception last night. Tell us, what was the mood like?
Amazing timing. We did book before, I have to say, Rachel Reeves did, but it was always great to get 100 businesses together and really hear what's people's stories. And family business stories are about people's lives, not just their businesses. So great to get our cohort together. And actually the budget didn't dominate in reality, surprisingly. The family business environment still reeling from the changes to family taxes that came through in the last budget, and that remains ever present. There were some minor tweaks yesterday which were welcome, specifically really aimed at the farmers, I think, because it was a 1 million to 2 million change. But nevertheless, we still remain really concerned that we're doing damage to our great family businesses at a time when what we're really after is growth. And I think the one thing largely missing from yesterday's budget were material growth measures.
Just speaking about the early leak, I had the once in a lifetime, I hope, well, probably never to be repeated experience of going on the radio half an hour before the Chancellor to read out the budget, which is very, very, very odd.
Steve and Richard, we'll be getting your take on the budget in just a minute. But first, let's start by getting a sense of the economic context, and who better to hear from than the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Helen Miller. Helen, welcome to The Business. There was a blizzard of announcements yesterday, the full smorgasbord, as it were. Could you give us the big picture view on the public finances, first of all? What has Rachel Reeves done with this budget?
Sure. Well, the big news yesterday was that despite having had months and months of speculation about the big fiscal repair job that the OBR was going to hand Rachel Reeves, they didn't hand her a big fiscal repair job, actually. We did see the productivity downgrade that everyone expected. What was unexpected was actually Rachel Reeves got a big increase in her revenue forecast. So actually, she didn't really have to do very much to meet her fiscal rules. What she did in response to that was raise taxes pretty substantially, about 26 billion. That's not far off of what she did last year. And she did that basically for two reasons. One was to increase spending. So part of this was a classic tax and spend budget. And partly it was to build a greater buffer, larger headroom against her fiscal rules. So the headroom doubling from what was 10 billion to now 22 billion. So that was the kind of big picture, higher taxes for higher spending and higher wiggle room.
Helen, like a lot of chancellors, Rachel Reeves yesterday backloaded a lot of those tax increases, the 26 billion you talked about. They won't come until for 3 or 4 years' time. That would take them into an election period. How credible are they then?
The tax rises are backloaded, as you suggest. Not only that, they've also penciled in some spending paring back, some spending cuts in that crucial pre-election period. Now they're hoping to manage that through efficiency savings, but of course, it's one thing to say you want efficiency; it's nothing to actually deliver it. So look, I think this would be a difficult pre-election period. Doesn't mean they can't do it. One thing in their favour is that actually freezing tax thresholds, which is the single biggest measure in the budget, is pretty stealthy. There's no day on which taxes jump up on a person's pay slips. They tend to go a little bit unnoticed. So actually the default now is that the Chancellor doesn't need to do anything. and the tax revenue will just flow in. So in some sense, that will make it a bit easier for her to do that. It might be harder to bring in some other newer taxes. But big picture, I think there are concerns that when that election period comes, the Chancellor won't be so keen to pare back spending and increase taxes.
And just briefly to follow on that, Helen, if the Chancellor is raising so much more in taxes, the previous budget and this budget, presumably public debt is going to come down quite a lot in the next few years.
Well, it's not, because spending is also increasing. So debt's actually going to be going up. So in the short run, actually, the Chancellor is borrowing more, and she's borrowing more to spend more. Then at the end of the period, there's the higher taxes. So by the end, debt will be falling, but from a higher level. And borrowing will have come down, but from a higher level. So in the short run, more borrowing, more debt. But then at the end, with this quite tight year at the end, tight couple of years, kind of bringing it all back together at the end. But that puts more weight on that end actually happening.
And Helen, as you said, this is a tax and spend budget. What does it mean for how people are feeling today? Are people feeling better or worse off? And what does it potentially mean for unemployment?
So it's partly a tax and spend budget. It's partly a tax to build headroom budget. And that's the sense that you're paying for something that you don't get services in return. You just get some insurance in return. It's also going to depend on basically on which families you are. If you're a low-income family with lots of children, more than 2 children, then you'll pretty quickly feel some positive benefits from this budget because you'll be getting higher welfare payments. And the tax rises don't come in until later. So most people at some point will bear higher taxes, but they won't see them for the next couple of years. So in the short run, you're probably feeling not much difference, or you're feeling maybe a bit better off. As we look forward to the end of the Parliament, then things change, and something like another 700,000 people will be dragged into paying any income tax at all. Another million or so paying higher rates of income tax. That is a material effect for people. On unemployment, sometimes I don't think you should expect a big effect as a result of this budget. There are some bits, minimum wages for young people have been worrying people. Some other bits on investment incentives might push in the wrong direction. But I don't think this is a big budget that you should be expecting to move the big things like unemployment or growth. And in some sense, on the second one of those, that's part of the problem. It was a big budget in terms of numbers. Remembering that the government has this big growth mission, it wasn't really a big budget for moving the dial on economic growth. Didn't do much damage, but also didn't make it much better.
Just on that growth point, Helen, the OBI, as you say, says that nothing in this budget will particularly improve growth. On Times Radio this morning, Rachel Reeves was really defiant, saying, well, I'm going to beat their forecasts, etc., etc. Is that remotely likely?
So I think there's a couple of points there. So one is, I do think it's right that we shouldn't over-calibrate to the OBR forecasts. The OBR is trying, in some sense, to do a different exercise. It's saying, has a measure been so big and material that we are really confident that it will drive up growth, and therefore it's enough to move our forecasts. And if you can do that, great, everyone loves those things. But there'll be a whole set of other measures that could be really important, really good to do, really good for growth, but they won't score in the OBR. But if you do enough of them, then over time, that'll drive your growth up. So the fact that it doesn't get into the OBR shouldn't be the test of whether it's worth doing or not. We should be looking more specifically at measures. I think the problem here is that, I've looked through the 75 measures on the scorecard, and I don't see anything there that's really going to really move very much. Again, there is no one measure that just makes everything okay, which I think why you have to doggedly just keep chipping away and finding these measures. And I don't see much in there for growth in this particular budget.
Helen Miller, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Richard, just listening to what Helen had to say there, she was sketching out the big picture, how the public finances are going to move as a result of this budget. That's very important for the gilts market, which this government is incredibly reliant on. What actually happened on the day? What was the reaction from the gilts market?
Well, the reaction was much better than expected from the gilts market, which I was surprised about because, I would describe this, because I don't work for the IFS, as the Klarna budget, because, it is the spend now, pay later, in terms of a lot of the measures were backdated and ahead of the budget, that had been one of the things we thought could spook
People
the
talked
money
about
markets.
that a lot, didn't they? If it was messy and if it was long dated, they would get worried.
Exactly. There were a lot of small measures, which there were, and it was long dated, the Klarna budget. Then you're right. That was the idea that the markets would be spooked. But the markets were effectively, the OBR handed Rachel Reeves a free pass with the much better than expected 21.7 billion headroom, which all came from the fact that although there was this productivity hit, which we obviously all talked about ahead of the budget, it was smaller than expected, and then changes to the inflation assumptions and how much that would be raised from taxation actually gave her a much larger headroom. And, we've both reported on corporate companies for many years, and there are lots like, for example, Next, who manage expectations brilliantly well. Now, this wasn't deliberate by Rachel Reeves managing expectations, but, the Treasury had been talking about a 15 billion headroom. I think the City had been expecting something similar to that, maybe somewhere between 10 and 15 billion. So it came in at 21 billion. So not surprisingly, we saw a really positive reaction. The pound rose, the cost of government borrowing fell. I think Deutsche Bank calculated that it was the best reaction since 2006. So there was a good market reaction. Now some of that has today, borrowing costs have started to creep up a little bit, and I think it is worth remembering that our borrowing costs are higher than other European countries. But the market reaction in terms of the money markets was very positive.
Well, what's interesting, Rich, actually, when you look in the documentation, they're forecasting about 50 basis points higher costs throughout the rest of the term. So they were obviously expecting the markets perhaps to change more than they did.
Yeah, absolutely. The OBR's forecasts for mortgage rates and long-term were really quite gloomy if you look at that.
Just while we're talking about that, was one really odd thing in the OBR. They said that mortgage rates, the average mortgage rate was going to go up from 3.7% at the minute to 5%. And they forecast that when interest rates are meant to be falling. What does the OBR know that we don't?
Exactly. I mean, that really stood out for me. In fact, actually, when someone raised that with me at first, I thought they'd misread.
Must be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought they'd read it wrong. But I went, and you're absolutely right. It is absolutely, it's quite sobering, to be absolutely honest.
And in the government debt, we've still got, very, very low interest rates for some portion of the government debt. So actually, when you roll forward at today's money, it's another 20 billion of costs when it comes through. So yeah, it's interesting to see some of the detail that sits in there and whether that really plays out.
And I do think it's interesting, the fact that a lot of this is, backdated. That does come at the end of the administration. You have to say, having listened to Rachel on Times Radio this morning, you do get the feeling she really does believe that she can grow the economy faster than most economists and definitely the OBR expect. Because otherwise, why would you be, as a politician, would you be going into this final year of administration knowing that you've got to cut spending really drastically and you're going to be hitting people with higher taxes?
Richard, I really like that, the Klarna budget. We're definitely going to use that
I think
again
we should copyright that. You didn't say that.
I stole it, I'm afraid. I stole it from elsewhere.
So speaking about sobering costs, Steve, I want to talk to you about hiring costs, because the government also announced rises in minimum wage this week, a 4.1% increase to £12.71 an hour from April 2026, plus a 6% rise for younger workers. And that's really hitting particularly smaller businesses, isn't it? What does it mean for a company like yours?
I think on the minimum wage, we've got generally 4.5% wage growth as a country. So to come in at 4.1% as a change, it broadly is in line with the market. And I'm okay with the change this year, if I'm being honest with you. I worry about the young people. I had a Saturday job when I was 16, worked in a clothes shop, and giddy £20 a day. And I got a start in life. It was my first job and it meant a lot. I met people, I got confident. And I worry about whether young people now at £10.80, I think, will they get the same opportunity? When you've got a high level of unemployment, we know there's 1 million young people that aren't in work or educational training. Do you need to take a risk on an 18 or a 20-year-old when there are people coming out of university with degrees who perhaps can fill that job? So I worry about the longer term societal implications. I also worry about graduates and the gap that's now appearing behind a minimum wage salary. On 40 hours, it's about £26,000. And outside of London, a grad gets 27, 28,000. So the value of an education is being eroded, and I think that's a real concern.
I do think it's interesting in that for many years, the minimum wage wasn't a political football. So after the introduction by Blair, there was a debate at the time about whether it would spark unemployment, and then it was set by committee, and the idea was it was set at a level that improved wages but wouldn't cause unemployment. And I think it was George Osborne, Don will remind me, who first started announcing that minimum wage was going to rise in his budgets. And it's increasingly become a political football where it's the Chancellor now touts it as a great success, the fact the minimum wage is rising. And I do think it really will hit youth unemployment. I mean, actually, there was one good piece of news in the OBR document about wider employment, in that for the third time they've now upgraded their estimation of the number of people participating in the workforce. Now, that does include people who are unemployed and are looking for a job, but it does suggest that sort of that sort of wave we saw moving away from the labour market after COVID, the Great Resignation, that is starting to reverse.
I think you're right. I think there's 1.5 million more people expected to go into the workplace during the time. That said, you've still got a rise from 3.5 to 4.1 million on people receiving benefits out of work, which, I mean, the two go counter against each other. As often these policies do, I have to say.
Well, this is the point about incoherence of policy that was being made by Rupert Soames, president of the CBI. Yeah. The idea that you increase minimum wage, but at the same, which makes it more difficult to employ people, but at the same time you're promoting policies that are trying to get people into work. The two things are pulling in different directions.
And we've got these bodies. I mean, the Low Paid Commission sets the expectation for minimum wage, but it's outside of Treasury's control. So the OBR is outside of Treasury control. So when you're looking at growth, you have to look at all measures, and we've got these other bodies driving counterproductive activity at the same time.
And I note when you said, Steve, that you feel okay about it, like 4.1% seems fair. All of the small businesses I've spoken to today who are still reeling from the changes made in the budget last year, for them, this just could be the death knell. Do you know what I mean? It's the final kind of nail in the coffin.
Yeah.
Were people saying that last night?
I'm sympathetic to certain industries where you've got very high concentrations of minimum wage staff. So take facilities management. We all know retail and hospitality are having a difficult time. I am sympathetic there because they've got their own set of pressures that are, if you like, systemic pressures in their industries on top of what's happening more broadly. I think for other industries, though, we are seeing salary rises more across the board, and I think an expectation to at least keep up with external salary rises. CPI is at 3.1%. As I say, salaries another percent higher. I think that probably is realistic. When we turn to things like pensioners and the triple lock, and we're giving those pensioners, who aren't in work, that higher rate, which is what the triple lock does, that feels less fair to me, if I'm being honest with you, especially when we're not rewarding some of our great public services like nurses in that same way.
Well, what about the broader drag on consumer confidence with tax thresholds being extended and, as the OBR says, household disposable income actually shrinking over the next, 4 years? Is that perhaps the bigger effect for business as a whole in this budget, rather than all the little taxes which are coming along?
Listen, I think confidence full stop is a major problem. So whether it's the consumer or it's business, the consumer confidence is probably the most important to start, and then business confidence follows. So, we're seeing very limited gain in the environment for the public in terms of what their household income is going to be in the next term. I think it's 1% growth. So unless people feel richer in their pockets, I think the UK public is saving 11 or 12% each month, and they're doing that because they're cautious, they're nervous. They're nervous perhaps about employment or about the state of the economy, and we need a confident country to get growth back in.
I mean, and it is interesting on the fiscal drag in that really is regressive. So the Resolution Foundation today arguing that actually for anyone earning under 37,000, a 1p rise in the income tax would have actually been fairer and would have cost them less. So that fiscal drag really is regressive. And as you say, George Osborne, you should get credit for the fact that he was the last chancellor to really try and pull people out of the tax system and raise thresholds rather than let them effectively fall, but thanks to inflation.
The people, Hannah, I feel most worried about in this actually are sort of middle earners, and they've really had a tough time in this. Whether it's the loss around pensions, or whether it's a change of rates around dividend if they're a smaller company, or whether it's a change around the threshold levels. I really feel that middle's getting squeezed really quite hard.
And isn't it in some ways kind of punishing ambition? Because if you think about, perhaps women coming back into the workplace after having children? Is it worth going for that promotion or pay rise? Or actually, I could work 3 days a week. I won't slip into the next tax bracket and spend a bit more time with my family. That makes that decision, easier in some ways, I suppose, don't you think?
The complication of our tax system is forcing those decisions. Do I go above the VAT threshold? Do I work another 5 hours because of my universal credit? Do I go back and work, more than 3 days a week? The tax system should promote contribution, should promote hard work. And instead, it's forestalling some of that activity.
Well, we could actually move on to two of the other quite complicated little bits of in this budget. One is the extra tax on passive incomes, so savings income and income from property, an extra 2% at every stage. So at the basic rate, you pay 22% rather than 20, 42, and then 47, if I've got my numbers right. Some people I spoke to yesterday, when I explained that to them, were absolutely outraged by this, even though it is a very small part of this budget and doesn't bring in much money at all. I think it's only something like £500 million. But the idea of being penalised for saving, an additional penalty for saving, was to them really, strange and odd. You talked about, the wrong kind of incentives. Is this an example of that?
It's a tax on a tax, for all intents and purposes. So they did, in all fairness, they didn't change the higher rate of dividend tax, which for most business owners is the rate that you're going to get paid against. So you've typically got a salary and a dividend, which is a share of your profitability.
Steve, just explain what that rate is, because if you get paid in a dividend, you take a dividend from your company, the rate you pay depends upon the income tax bracket you're in.
Yeah, so first of all, let's say you earn £100, you first of all get corporation tax, so that reduces that down to whatever rate you're applying, 19 or 25%. And then you receive then a dividend tax on top of that. So the top rate is 39.5%. That remained exactly as it was. But for the lower level dividend rates, again, they were increased. But these duplicated taxes, like on savings, it does feel as though why are we incentivizing people to save money? We know that the state pension system is not sustainable long term, either as a mechanism or providing enough for later life, as we're all living much more. We're at 12 million pensioners today. We're moving to 18 million by 2050. So we've got a huge issue brewing up in our pension environment, yet we're not incentivizing saving, which seems crazy to me.
And at the same time as you reducing the amount you could hold if you're under 65 in a cash ISA. The great example yesterday of a tax becoming complicated was the mansion tax, as it's being called.
We're going to talk about it now. We're going to come on to it. But let's just explain how it works. I'll explain how it works. So the valuation office goes round from 2029, 2028, 2029, and values properties. If you have a house worth more than 2 million, you pay an annual charge of £2,500, and there are bands going up to a maximum annual charge of £7,500 if your house is worth more than 5 million. How's that going to work, Richard?
Well, exactly, and you've got these cliff edges where if I'm 2,499,000 or 2,500,000, there's this massive difference. So that's obviously going to create lots of challenges. I think in his tweet yesterday, Paul Johnson, the Times columnist and the former director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, described it as ridiculous. It is a really bad tax. And I think everyone not everyone, but most people would agree that we're not taxing property in an efficient way. Obviously stamp duty, a real drain on mobility, gums up the housing market, and council tax bans are obviously not fair. If you're living in a very, very good house in Westminster, you're paying far less council tax than elsewhere in the country. So it does need reform, but this was not the reform it needed. And I think that's the most disappointing thing about the last two budgets, or Rachel Reeves' first two budgets, is they haven't been about tax reform. And actually, we have a ridiculously complicated tax system, and it would be really nice to have a chancellor who actually wanted to reform some taxes, make it simpler, make it more efficient, and help generate some growth in the UK economy. And we've seen no evidence of that. We've seen no evidence of desire to grip those thorny problems, and deal with some of the inefficiencies and make it simpler. And actually, we've probably missed the opportunity now, because if you're going to do that as a chancellor, you need to do that in the first couple of years of your administration, particularly because you probably do need to consult, you probably do need to talk to people. And so the fact that she hasn't reformed our tax system means she probably isn't now, even if she still is chancellor at the next budget. And then you're then getting so close to an election that you're unlikely to see that happen. So, that for me is the biggest disappointment, alongside the lack of growth opportunities. It's the lack of a desire to tackle some of those really difficult issues. The only sign of her doing that was the electric vehicle, the pay per mile. Now, obviously, that's going to be deeply unpopular with drivers, but we do have to find a way to replace fuel duty, because obviously that is going to disappear over the next decade, 2 decades, however long. So it was good to see that being introduced, and we are going to have to move to some sort of way for people to tax cars. But that was the only that really was that was the only reform I can think of which was actually tackling the system.
Just returning briefly to the theme of kind of the mansion tax, Steve. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that you live in a nice house.
It's a safe bet.
So how do you feel about paying, up to £7,500 extra a year?
Listen, I think if you're living in a £5 million house or more, you've probably got a reasonable sized mortgage. And this is probably a relatively minor change
but is it something
in that regard.
About in terms of the signal it sends in terms of kind of wealth creation? If you're an entrepreneur, you've made some money, you want to buy yourself a nice house. Is it just another way of clobbering ambitious people?
I think back to Richard's point, we've got a situation where the tax system needs reform. I've done lots of London development over the years, and the market hasn't moved in West London for over 10 years. And stamp duty as a tax take also hasn't moved in the last 10 years. Time cost money is 50% over that period. So broadly, things have gone down, not up. And actually, if we reform the tax system, promote people moving again, we're going to take more tax. We've seen that with capital gains tax. There's a certain peak point, as we know. And I really think there is need for urgent reform, because the majority of those houses are going to be in London. And the London housing market, as we know, both on new starts and on current transactions, is desperately low. And we could really do with getting the capital moving. It is the engine of our economy.
So is this the way to do it?
I think the way to... No, this is a short-term fix. I think we're talking about 600 million raised in this measure. So this is where this smorgasbord of activity, the small pieces add together.
And the money, by the way, doesn't go to improve your council services, does it? It goes straight to central government.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. But this is red meat for her backbenchers. This was never about trying to make the taxation of property more efficient, which it needs to be.
Yes.
This was purely about being able to throw to the left of the party, there's a mansion tax.
I heard Ed Balls climbing back from it today, saying it was a historic policy. So it's interesting that it's not one of their current ones, but it's in the context, I think, of having large houses. And we all know that we're paying far too little in London for council tax in many regards. I don't think it's an unfair issue, but it does go back to the point. If we're going to get out of the mess that we're in, get some engine in the economy, we need a more dynamic tax system that both promotes growth and allows us to raise revenue on the back of that growth. And we have a progressive tax system. We have a large amount of the wealth in the country paying the majority of the tax. But we just need to find a way to get the economy moving, and more people coming into that tax envelope, for me, is a good thing, because it means their salaries are moving forward and they're starting to get on that ladder of really contributing to society and, importantly, to their families.
Hannah's got some good news in a minute on EMI, not the record label, but EMI and ECI. But just before that, Richard, very briefly, you started as a property journalist, so you understand these things. I was trying to work out what was happening with the business rates yesterday. And to be honest, it seemed to me there were some winners and some really bad losers. Who are the winners and who are the losers?
Well, I think there's fewer winners than perhaps was spun yesterday. Right. So big retailers are definitely losers. The government would argue that some of the smaller businesses who've been given business rate breaks, so the pubs, small shops, are the winners, although James Hurley is currently crunching the numbers.
Because
and
I
it
saw
seems-
today someone saying, a pub owner saying, hang on, this stuff about me getting a lower business rates is a load of old rubbish. It's actually gone up.
It does look like it may not be quite as generous as was spun yesterday.
I think it's if you're in a group that it goes up, but if you're an individual, I think you've probably got a reduction.
Absolutely, but it's not quite as good as being tabbed. But business rates is another example of, somewhere where we really do need, the type of businesses that make, that make profits in this country has changed beyond all recognition. So, we know how unfair business rates are in terms of, the burden falling on retailers, traditional retailers, particularly pubs, hospitality. It's obviously an easy thing to tax. You can see it, you know who owns it, and it's difficult to move it offshore because it's property. So it's, you can see the attraction of taxing it, but we do need to think about how business rates and how we assess the value. And it also discourages investment in that people don't want to invest in their property because then their rateable value goes up.
Well, Alex Baldock, who we had on the podcast a few weeks ago, will be very cross, I'm sure.
He will.
So as you said, I do have some good news, which you'll all be relieved about. So obviously, Alex de Pledge went into the Treasury some 6 months ago.
Who is she?
So she's the Treasury's or Rachel Reeves' entrepreneur advisor. And the whole point is that she's a quite outspoken, I think it's fair to say, northerner who has a track record in building technology businesses. And the idea is that she would go in and come up with a raft of measures to support entrepreneurs, particularly tech founders, in growing their businesses. And, Rachel Reeves put it kind of front and centre at the start of the budget yesterday, saying she wants to make the UK the best place to start and scale a business and also to stay. And, some of the measures that were announced yesterday have been really warmly received. I think of all of the groups of people I've seen opinions from today across social media and the like, there are some people that are actually genuinely pretty happy in the technology world. And I'd love to get your view on this in just a second, Steve. But for our listeners, the EMI scheme, which is a share option scheme, which I've been writing about and trying to convince people that it's interesting for absolutely months.
More money for tech bros is something we can all get behind, isn't it?
Well, tech bros and girls, Dom.
Sorry.
I hope you're not mansplaining to me too much here today. But so the idea is that these very generous tax breaks will be given to more employees of technology scale-ups. So the employee cap has doubled from 250 to 500 employees. And there was another cap on kind of gross assets, which has quadrupled from 30 million to 120 million. So that will benefit many more tech scale-ups. And why should people care? Well, if we can get brilliant and bright people into our tech scale-ups, they stand a much better chance of succeeding. And there were other measures as well about EIS being extended, which is, of course, the Enterprise Investment Scheme, which gives tax breaks to investors in early stage businesses. And these are things that people really care about in our world, aren't they, Steve?
They are, definitely.
So do you share the positivity?
Well, first of all, hats off to Alex. She's done a great job. It's great to see someone coming from outside Treasury into Treasury, being listened to. And these are things I've lobbied for actually for a number of years. I did something called the Private Business Commission, lobbying for the same thing. So really pleased that's happened. We also saw for new IPOs, stamp duty for 3 years coming off. So those three measures probably are the most pro-growth measures we saw in the budget. So all positive. One slight negative, and I have to hype back to family businesses, the EMI tax change cost more to implement than the change for business family companies and the tax that the Treasury has now received. So the BPR change for last year was 500 million and EMI tax shares is 660 million. So we support one very small group, the 16,000 businesses that benefit from EMI shares, and we damage, a huge number of farms and businesses.
Can we just explain those acronyms there?
Yeah.
So EMI and BPR.
So business property relief is a tax that applies to a company upon death, and a new inheritance tax charge
it's
is
in
brought
essence
in.
the farmer's problem, but
it's the family farm tax.
All family
exactly right, Dom.
Yeah.
Exactly,
and
right.
that sort of got slightly overlooked, didn't it, in the whole
last year?
Yes.
And then on share schemes, we really don't have a very good share scheme structure in the UK. It's one of the issues why the US does better. So they're great at incentivising their people. Actually, even for public companies, it's really difficult. For private companies, it's almost impossible. The one highlight is the EMI scheme. So it allows for those share options to be given. And the rules have been changed, they've been extended. It allows the size of companies being much larger as it goes through funding rounds. So don't get me wrong, I really, really applaud them doing that. I just reference it that we are focusing on one group of very small businesses and not a broader set that makes up a quarter of the economy. But hats off to Alex, she did a great job on getting it through.
And the changes to the rules around being able to give your business to a trust owned by the staff, obviously we saw there, and we have seen some abuse of that scheme, to be fair to the government, but they've basically reduced the tax benefits for the founder or the owner of the business, giving it to their staff. Do you think that's damaging?
No, I don't, to be honest. I think it was generous. So previously you could sell your company to your staff, they would pay you over a period of time, there was no capital gains tax. So that's now reduced to 50%, so you'll pay 12% capital gain tax. It's still really competitive. So, and I really believe in employment ownership trust. It's a really great way to transition a company.
Yeah.
Listen, we could probably do a 2-hour podcast on the budget, but we are slightly heading towards our natural closing period. Richard, you want to interject before I give you a final question?
Can I hijack and just ask Steve a question? So I interviewed Ranjit Singh Baparan a few weeks ago.
The Chicken King.
The Chicken King.
He's got an amazing business, 25,000 people. He's a great man.
Absolutely. And he was bemoaning the fact that he couldn't get a meeting with the Chancellor or the Prime Minister. Genuinely, he'd written to them, he'd asked for a meeting and they wouldn't meet him. And he joked that he should rename himself Blackstone. And we've obviously seen this morning a number of coordinated announcements in the aftermath of the budget. So we've seen JP Morgan confirm that they're going to build this massive tower in Canary Wharf, which is a great announcement, don't get me wrong. It's a huge investment in the UK, great for the financial services reputation of the city, but it was obviously timed. They obviously knew they were going to make the announcement, so they timed it for this morning. We've seen Goldman Sachs make an announcement about investing in Birmingham. Do you sometimes feel that it would be easier for your members to get an audience if they were a US investment bank than a British family business?
Listen, it's very difficult for the government to see everybody. That's the purpose of trade associations like Family Business UK, like the CBI. I've got some sympathy that they can't have access at the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, but they should be engaged. You know, Ranjit's running a great business. He's our number one producer of chickens. He's our number one producer of ready meals. He's a man that should be listened to, and but it can't always be at the very, very top.
Sorry for hijacking your podcast.
No, hijack away. I was trying to think of a positive way to leave this. One of the criticisms of this budget, which I think you sort of touched on, Richard, and which Helen Miller talked about earlier, was that there wasn't much in the way of economic strategy. None of the big problems of the economy tackled: tax reform, VAT reform, all that sort of stuff. Where are we going to be in 5 years' time running into an election? What's the UK economy going to look like? I think we kind of know, don't we? High tax, high debt, low growth. What's going to break that?
Well, if we did finally discover how to make ourselves more productive again, we would hopefully have a more vibrant economy. We basically have had, even pre-COVID, really since the financial crisis, we've had a period of low growth, low productivity. And as not just the UK, but also, although we've suffered more perhaps than most, but, Europe as a whole, if we can find a way to get back some of that productivity, some of that growth, we could have a very different economy. Because as was shown yesterday by the fact the headroom was larger than expected, you don't need a huge shift in some of these numbers. We've had, if we could get this sort of very persistent inflation out of the economy, that would help for starters. So I wouldn't be too gloomy, but we do need to find a way to sort of get that growth and get that productivity back.
And one thing I'd like to add, perhaps to add a kind of glimmer of hope, is I spoke to a founder this morning who has raised investment for her food business at a time it's really difficult to raise money for businesses like that. And they're moving into a much larger premises. And because margins are so tight, they're deploying lots more automation. So they're not employing more people. They're not getting rid of the ones they have got. But it's that idea of, necessity being the mother of invention, right? So it's going to make her business more productive. And I know that's only one tiny example, but perhaps all businesses.
No, but I think, Hannah, you're right. I mean, with the AI thing, we can't yet define exactly what will happen to productivity, but the expectations from the ABR were really minor on productivity gains. I think it was 0.9%. if we can get AI deployed, and it's a relatively short window between now and the next election, but if we can start to deploy AI, then we can get greater productivity as a country.
So you think AI might be this magic bullet that could help with Richard's problem of productivity?
It wasn't mentioned a lot yesterday, was it? But, it's a pretty important global issue. It's a seismic shift out there, and the UK is doing some good things. We've got some good investment coming down the line. If we can really embrace AI, I do think we can get some productivity gain.
I mean, the AI was mentioned for two reasons in the OBI forecast. So there was a little section on could it give the economic growth we so badly need, but there was also a warning that if the AI bubble bursts, that will probably, throw all of her forecasts off track. So there's good news and bad news as far as AI is concerned.
But I think
let's focus on the good news, shall we?
I'd finish on a positive note. I do think the government somehow need a break, and we need to try and go forward. There is optimism in the business community. We just really hope that the chaos we've been through stops and we can start motoring forward.
Richard doesn't want to let you have the last word.
No, sorry. The other good news, you can cut this out, but the other great good news was we're only going to get one official OBR forecast a year, which is a reform we should all welcome, and we can stop this constant, is she going to breach her fiscal rules?
Well, thank you both for finishing on a high. We spoke, of course, earlier to Helen Miller of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and in the studio, our colleague Richard Fletcher, business editor of The Times, and Steve Rigby of the Rigby Group.
I'm Dominic O'Connell, business columnist for The Times and a correspondent on Times Radio.
And I'm Hannah Prevett, associate business editor of The Sunday Times.
And this is The Business. As well as listening to us on your podcast platform, you can watch us on YouTube.
You can indeed, and you can like and subscribe on all platforms. Please leave us a comment or get in contact at thebusiness@thetimes.com.
See you next week.
See you then.